Welcome back, guys, and happy 2020. I am so glad I finally have some time to be filming again. I hopefully will be able to be filming more this year. That's my goal, New Year's resolution, whatever you want to call it. But then again, I say that every time I film a video, so we'll see. Anyways, today I decided to do another spooky location story. Before we get started, my hair is a little poofy, so just ignore it. I don't know what's happening today. Anyways, so I love talking about spooky locations that aren't probably as known about in the public eye, kind of lesser known locations that I find really cool. I think it adds a little extra fear factor, and plus I love listening to the same spooky location stories over and over again, because every time you watch a different video or read a different article about a haunted location, you always learn something new. But I also love branching out a little bit and exploring those areas that no one's probably even heard of anyways. Like my prior video, I did talk about the Jonathan Ward house, and I knew a lot of people had never heard of it before. And today I'm going to talk about the Danvers State Asylum, or the Danvers State Hospital. So that is obviously located in Danvers, Massachusetts, right next to Salem. Really cool kind of fun fact is Danvers actually used to be part of Salem, and a good majority of the Salem witch trials actually occurred in Danvers, Massachusetts. Actually, a major majority of it occurred there. More so than Salem, really. Salem just kind of took the tourist aspect of it all. But I'm going to dive into why I feel like that's a little bit important a little bit later on in the video. But today we are going to talk about the asylum. So just kind of a quick background, the Danvers State Asylum doesn't exist anymore, or it was obviously called the Danvers State Hospital going into later years. It's actually apartment complexes now, which once I get into these stories, I don't know how people live there. I give them props. Apparently nothing happens there now, supposedly, but I would still have a heart attack living there. Anyways, so let's kind of dive right on into it. So obviously at the time, this was about, I would say, the late 1800s. So asylums at this time period, throughout all of the 1800s really, even the early to mid 1900s, was for a wide variety of people. So it was people who were too poor that they couldn't afford to live, so they were sent to asylums. It was people with disabilities. It was people with actual mental illnesses that needed help. And then also, it was just people who didn't fit into the social norm. So this was people who just strayed away from society, was a little awkward, did things that made them flamboyant or more like seen by the public eye. Basically anything that was considered strange at the time, you could be sent off to an asylum. So obviously this is going to lead to overcrowding and issues in the different asylums in the area. So focusing on Massachusetts alone, all of the surrounding asylums in the area, or institutions, whatever you want to call them, were having a huge issue in the late 1800s with overcrowding. And it only got worse when one in Boston, in South Boston, I believe, shut its doors. So obviously you have all these patients that are leaving this hospital only to be transferred to other hospitals that are already overcrowding. So this was when the state kind of had to realize we need a new property. And this time they needed one that wasn't set in the middle of a city. They needed one with an open space where they could build and expand and just have a lot of room to really make this hospital what it needs to be. So this is kind of where the idea of building a new state hospital came to be. And so they decided to kind of set their focus on Danvers because there was a lot of rural area, a lot of open space, a lot of like air, hills, whatever they thought the patients at the time might need to help them with their treatments. And so basically there was a man named Francis Dodge who owned 500 acres of land in Danvers. That was just fields and hills and everything. So the Commonwealth actually bought it from him in 1874. And this is where kind of the idea started rolling to make this massive building. So the doors officially opened for the Danvers State Asylum. By the way, I have my little notes down here. If I keep looking down, I have to keep referring to them because there's so much information. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So the doors officially opened in 1878, or at least that's when they started admitting the first patients. It was a huge, I believe, 8-building complex at that time. And everyone was admitted. Like I said before, like you had people who, it was mainly mental illness, obviously, but then there was also health breakouts, different kinds of like tuberculosis, everything that ran in terms of illnesses, disabilities, poor farms. And what was big for the time is when it first opened, they really wanted to combat the idea of overcrowding. They really wanted to avoid this. They had all new staff, they had all new superintendents that were running this place, and it was kind of the first of its kind in terms of their practices. They kind of realized that maybe in order to help these people, we should treat them in a humane way. And I say humane for the late 1800s version of humane, because prior to this, a lot of people thought if there was something wrong with you, it was probably demonic and you were probably a sinful person and you should probably be exorcised or treated inhumanely in order to fix these problems. And I'm kind of glad Danvers was like, hey, this really isn't a good idea, considering 200 years before, we were having a big issue with that and executed a lot of women for being witches, and there was nothing wrong with them. So anyways, they decided to treat their patients a little bit more humanely, and they realized that maybe different types of therapy could help them in certain aspects. Obviously, it depended what this patient was inputted there for, but they just thought, maybe changing things up will better the institution and better the lives of all of these people. So kind of going into that, at first it was seen as transformational, especially for like all institutions, all asylums, whatever you want to call it, it was considered the first of its kind. And then the late 1800s hit. So let it be known, this was opened in 1878, and by the mid 1880s, overcrowding was already an issue. Which, I mean, with any asylum that they had in the area, this was bound to happen. Only issue is when they built this place, it went way over their building costs, and funding for the area as a whole, especially for the hospital, was already poor. So the fact that they're already over their building costs, now they're not getting that much funding, staffing levels were staying the same even though the amount of inpatients were rising, and all the issues kind of started flowing from that point on. So leading into the early 1900s, the worst of the worst came around the 1930s. This was when overcrowding was at an all-time high. The death toll was rising beyond what they could imagine because they did not have enough beds and they did not have enough staff or funding to properly help these patients. At this point, they were turning towards new therapy procedures that in their eyes they still saw as humane, but in today's eyes we know aren't. They were trying shock therapy and they were doing lobotomies, and it came to the point where there was just so much overcrowding that they would have to resort to using straitjackets for their patients to keep people in line because there wasn't enough staff to keep an eye over everyone at once. And obviously some of these patients did have severe mental illness, which could cause them to lash out, could cause them to try to escape. I'm sure other people, just not because they had mental illness, were probably trying to escape this place at this point. And funding just continuously started getting worse. And then in 1941, there was actually a fire that broke out in one of the barns that were on the property. And let it be known, prior to this point, they did have money to expand and build new facilities and new wings to try to combat that overcrowding. But no matter what, the more beds they added, the surplus amount of patients they were putting on top of the additional beds that they had. And meanwhile, once again, the staffing was pretty much staying the same. So this fire broke out at the barn and caused $60,000 worth of damage, which at the time, they obviously did not have the money to be able to rebuild and pay for that. It also apparently caused one of the biggest traffic jams in Massachusetts state history, which I found really interesting, solely because all these people who knew the fire was breaking out wanted to go see the building burn down. Great. And it literally caused a traffic jam because everyone wanted to go see the building burn. And then when it was only the barn, people were a little bit disappointed, which is interesting. But I guess in the 1930s, they didn't really have much other better things to do. Anyways, so as time went on from there, between the 60s, 70s, 80s, the place just kept deteriorating. At this point, they started slowly moving patients out of wings and shutting down wings, transporting patients to different hospitals, basically doing whatever they had to do to try to help the hospital, try to rebuild it, try to work on staffing levels, and try to get that funding. If they tried to condense the building, they would need less funding, I guess you could say. But all in all, the place was just crumbling down. And going on from that, the conditions were still inhumane. They were awful. Patients were trying to escape. Patients were ending up dying because they were escaping and were found dead. It was just completely unnatural the way that these patients were being treated. And finally, in 1992, the building shut its doors, and that was for good. At that point, they had cleared out the last wing, they had cleared out the last section of the hospital, and they just shut down. And from there, the building remained abandoned for a really long time. And what's kind of crazy is, so at this point, obviously there was a huge death toll. They actually had a cemetery on property with unnamed graves of just the people and the amount of patients who died that they just didn't bother to keep track of. So clearly this is gonna lead to some ghost activity. And so what's really crazy is as soon as they shut their doors, the area and the buildings were still heavily monitored, which is pretty insane because they didn't want these ghost adventurers, ghost hunters to go onto this property. They wanted it. They knew it was still private property. It was still owned by the state, and it was on a historic landmark list. So they really didn't want anything to fully happen to it until someone could possibly pay to have it renovated. So even though it was heavily monitored and things like that, obviously people are still breaking in. People were still going in because whether they were adventure seekers, ghost hunters, whatnot, they wanted to come see the abandoned property. And when it's sitting abandoned for about 13 years, obviously things are gonna occur and people are gonna find things out. And that's exactly what happened. While people were exploring, a lot of people claimed to hear disembodied voices, see shadows, and even hear footsteps that were coming from nowhere. A lot of people would walk their dogs in the area or go walk around the building and not even go inside of it, and they would see shadows of people looking out the windows or full apparitions of people looking out the windows back at them. And it's really insane to hear some of the stories, even from the nurses and things like that who were working within the building while it was still opened. They said that they would hear people following them. There was long hallways. There was a tunnel system that went underneath that was always dark. And they said that even if they were alone, they constantly felt like they were being watched or someone was right behind them. Or they were feeling like they were being touched, tugged, all these crazy things. And a lot of people who did go in after the fact and said that they did hear the wailing and the moaning of these disembodied voices really do believe it's just the patients that were lost their lives, or the people who are unmarked in the cemetery and want to be known, want to be found, or at least want to be given a just and respectful death or burial, I guess you could say. And so in 1998, what happened was the community of Danvers, I'm not really sure what group exactly, they went and they identified all the bodies that were in the cemetery on property to give them a respectful headstone, to showcase their name, to show that they weren't just a number, to show that they were an actual person, and to kind of give that respectful manner to probably put some spirits at ease as well. And kind of like just going off of that, I also want to talk about the structure as a whole. So for the time, this Gothic structure, as you've already seen in all of these pictures, I kind of meant to touch upon this at the beginning, but we're just going to talk about it now. So what's really cool about this structure is it was extremely iconic. I mean, the Gothic architecture was huge. It was massive. It had this big cathedral in the front, which later was taken down because they couldn't keep up with it. But it was actually the setting. This is kind of why I wanted to talk about it, because I feel like people who might not even know that the Danvers State Hospital had existed might realize or recognize it from these pictures, because it was also the filming location for a lot of movies. It was the inspiration for countless horror books, horror TV shows. In around 2000, I believe that's when it was filmed. The 2002 movie Session 9 was completely filmed in that hospital. A lot of it was inspired by that hospital. Like I said, books and things like that. And then I also like to talk about season 2 of American Horror Story, The Asylum. So you can kind of get context clues from the show that the asylum that they're in is based in Massachusetts. You have a lot of context clues in terms of the building itself looks a lot like what the Danvers State Hospital used to look like. They kind of give a lot of hints and pieces that it is supposed to be based off the Danvers State Hospital, especially because there's newspaper articles and they talk about surrounding towns, and Framingham is mentioned, which is the surrounding town to Danvers, a little bit farther away, but still in the same vicinity, where Jessica Lange's character, Sister Jude, is known to struck and kill a small girl with her car. And you kind of get all these little pieces and this inspiration to kind of hint that they were really aiming towards focusing and kind of basing this whole series, or the second season, off the Danvers State Hospital, which is really insane and kind of cool to know that I'm so close to this kind of spooky inspiration in history, even though it's obviously such a tragic past. So kind of going off of that, in 2008, the whole complex, well, I should say the interior, they kind of kept the main frame and outside buildings to kind of keep the architecture, was taken down and turned into apartment complexes. And people claim that since they've been turned into apartment complexes, they haven't seen or heard of any true spiritual activity. But obviously, I don't think anyone who's been living within the complexes voluntarily have been living within the complexes have said anything, which is kind of crazy because I am very curious if things still go on there, especially because if you still have the outer framework of the building, you're still next to the cemetery where hundreds of bodies, are more than hundreds of bodies, are buried. You would think that something crazy would be going on, but I also heard a rumor that it was blessed before they fully started building the apartments. I don't know how true that is. They also had a lot of issues during construction because I don't think people were very happy that it was turning into apartment complexes. But overall, I think it's a really interesting location, and the whole building is just looming and kind of gives off this eerie vibe. Even when they were building it, I'm sure they knew some spooky stuff was going to happen in there. But overall, I am so glad you guys stayed tuned and listened to this whole thing. I'm still getting used to giving these like story time stories, so I'm sorry if it didn't make sense. I'm sorry if I sound like a mess. I'm working on it. But overall, like I said, I'm really hoping to start doing more of these videos, or at least more videos in general for my channel. I really want to grow my follower account, especially on here, on my Instagram, on my blog. And overall, I really want you guys to comment down below if you liked it, if there's other spooky locations that you want me to film or different